The red light on camera 2 was still glowing when Senator James McCormack realized his political career was over. It was March 15, 1969, and Dean Martin had just finished singing "Where Have All the Flowers Gone" on his live television variety show, dedicating it to all the young people who believe in peace. What happened in the next 60 seconds, when Dean looked directly into the camera and addressed the Republican senator who had been threatening him for weeks, didn't just end McCormack's influence in Washington. It redefined what it meant to stand up to political intimidation on national television. Studio 4 at NBC Burbank buzzed with the controlled chaos of live television production. Camera operators adjusted their positions while sound technicians monitored levels through oversized headphones. The audience of 300 sat in near darkness beyond the bright stage lights, their faces occasionally illuminated by the warm glow spilling from the performance area. Dean Martin stood center stage in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his trademark cigarette sending lazy spirals of smoke into the studio lights, looking as relaxed as if he were singing in his own living room instead of broadcasting to 20 million American homes. But beneath Dean's famous cool, tension crackled like electricity through a broken wire. For 3 weeks, Senator James McCormack had been waging a campaign to destroy Dean's career, using every weapon in his considerable political arsenal. Phone calls to network executives, threats to television sponsors, whispered conversations in congressional corridors about entertainment that undermines American values during wartime. McCormack represented everything Dean had grown to despise about political power, the willingness to destroy individual lives in service of abstract principles. Senator McCormack was 62 years old in March 1969, a career politician who had built his reputation on unwavering support for the Vietnam War and vocal opposition to what he called the hippie element, corrupting American youth. From his office in the Russell Senate Office Building, McCormack had watched Dean Martin's television show with growing alarm as the entertainer began including songs that could be interpreted as anti-war statements. When Dean performed "Blowin' in the Wind" in February, McCormack had issued a press statement calling it inappropriate entertainment during a time of national sacrifice. When Dean followed it with "The times they are a-changing," 2 weeks later, McCormack had begun making phone calls. The senator's campaign against Dean had started quietly, with private meetings in mahogany-paneled offices where threats were delivered in the polite language of political influence. Network executives received calls about sponsor concerns. Advertising agencies heard about congressional oversight of entertainment content. Casino owners in Las Vegas were reminded about federal regulations that affect gaming licenses. The message was clear: Dean Martin needed to change his tune or face the consequences. Dean had received his first direct warning through his manager, Mort Viner, who arrived at Dean's Beverly Hills home on a Tuesday morning, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "Dean, we've got a problem. A big one. Senator McCormack's people have been making calls. They want you to stop singing anything that could be considered political protest." Dean had been practicing golf swings in his backyard, but he stopped mid-swing when he heard McCormack's name. The guy from Illinois? What's his problem? His problem is that he thinks you're turning America's youth against the war effort. He's got connections to 3 major sponsors of your show, and he's threatening to pull their support if you don't adjust your content to better reflect American values. Dean had continued his golf swing, sending an imaginary ball sailing over his pool. "Mort, I sing songs. I don't start wars or end them. If this guy has a problem with music, maybe he should take it up with Bob Dylan." But McCormack wasn't interested in reasonable discussion. Over the following weeks, the pressure had intensified. Sponsors began requesting meetings about content concerns. Network executives started suggesting that Dean consider his audience when selecting songs. The language was always diplomatic, but the threat was unmistakable: conform or be silenced. Dean had never considered himself a political activist. Unlike some of his contemporaries who embraced causes publicly, Dean had always maintained that his job was to entertain people, not lecture them. But something about McCormack's campaign had awakened a stubbornness in Dean that even his closest friends found surprising. Maybe it was growing up in Steubenville, where working-class families respected independent thinking. Maybe it was his natural antipathy toward bullies of any kind. Or maybe it was simply that Dean Martin had spent 30 years in show business without letting anyone tell him what to sing. and he wasn't about to start now. The breaking point had come 3 days before the March 15th show, when Senator McCormack made a tactical error that revealed the true extent of his ambitions. Instead of continuing to work behind the scenes, he decided to make his threats public, issuing a press statement that accused Dean Martin of using his platform to spread anti-war propaganda that demoralizes our troops and encourages draft resistance among American youth. The statement had been picked up by newspapers across the country, creating exactly the kind of public controversy that McCormack thought would force Dean to back down. It's time for entertainers to remember that they have a responsibility to support American foreign policy, McCormack had told reporters. Mr. Martin needs to decide whether he's going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. The press statement had been McCormack's mistake, because it transformed a private power struggle into a public challenge that Dean Martin couldn't ignore without appearing weak. Dean had built his career on projecting effortless confidence, on never backing down from anyone. McCormack had just challenged that reputation in front of the entire country. Frank Sinatra had called that night, his voice tight with anger. Dean, this bastard is trying to do to you what they did to the Hollywood 10 in the 50s. You can't let him get away with it. I'm not planning to, Dean had replied, but I'm going to handle it my way. What's your way? Saturday night, live television, 20 million witnesses. Now, standing on the NBC stage with cameras rolling and America watching, Dean was about to make good on that promise. He had just finished Where Have All the Flowers Gone, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had lived through 2 wars and watched too many young men die in both. The song's anti-war message was unmistakable, and Dean had delivered it with the kind of quiet conviction that made even his most casual performances seem profound. As the final notes faded, Dean walked to the edge of the stage, closer to the cameras than he usually positioned himself. He looked directly into camera 2, his expression serious in a way that viewers rarely saw from the King of Cool. Ladies and gentlemen, Dean began, his voice carrying clearly through television speakers in living rooms across America. I want to talk to you about something that's been on my mind lately. The studio audience sensed something unusual was happening. The normal rhythm of a variety show had been broken, replaced by something more intimate and more dangerous. There's a United States Senator, a man named James McCormack from Illinois, who thinks he has the right to tell me what songs I can sing on my own television show. Dean continued. Senator McCormack believes that because we're fighting a war in Vietnam, American entertainers should only perform material that he considers supportive of government policy. The camera moved closer, filling television screens with Dean's face. His expression was calm, but there was steel underneath the smoothness. Now, I've never claimed to be a political expert. I'm just a singer from Ohio who got lucky enough to make a living entertaining people. But I know something about America, and I know something about freedom, and I know that when politicians start telling artists what they can and can't say, we're heading down a very dangerous road. In living rooms across the country, viewers stopped what they were doing to pay attention. This wasn't the usual Dean Martin performance. This was something unprecedented. Senator McCormack has threatened my sponsors, pressured my network, and publicly accused me of demoralizing our troops, Dean said, his voice getting slightly harder. He seems to think that questioning a war is the same as opposing our soldiers. He seems to believe that the First Amendment only applies to speech that the government approves of. Dean moved even closer to the camera, his eyes seeming to look directly at every viewer. I want to say something to Senator McCormack wherever he might be watching tonight. Dean continued. This is America, not the Soviet Union. In America, we don't have government censors deciding what songs can be sung or what thoughts can be expressed. In America, we don't threaten people's livelihoods because they ask questions about government policy. The studio was absolutely silent. Even the camera operators had stopped moving, transfixed by what they were witnessing. You want to know what demoralizes our troops, Senator? Dean asked, his voice rising slightly. It's not folk songs about peace. It's the knowledge that they're fighting and dying in a war that their own government can't adequately explain or justify. It's the realization that while they're in the jungle getting shot at, politicians back home are more concerned with silencing critics than with bringing them home safely. Dean paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. I've got friends with sons in Vietnam. I've got fans with brothers and husbands over there. And you know what they tell me? They don't want me to stop singing songs that ask hard questions. They want someone to keep asking those questions until we get some honest answers. The camera pulled back slightly, showing Dean's full figure as he delivered his conclusion. So here's what I'm going to tell you. Senator McCormack, and anyone else who thinks they can intimidate free Americans into silence. I'll sing whatever songs I believe are worth singing. I'll ask whatever questions I think need to be asked. And I'll do it on my television show, in my concerts, and anywhere else I damn well please. Dean's voice had gotten harder now. The cool facade completely dropped. You see, that's what freedom actually means. Not the freedom to say only what the government approves of, but the freedom to think for yourself, to question authority, and to speak truth as you understand it. And if that makes me an enemy of James McCormack's version of America, then I'm proud to be that enemy. Dean straightened his tie and smiled that trademark smile, but there was nothing relaxed about it now. Because the America I believe in, the America my father came to as an immigrant, the America that welcomed him and gave his son opportunities beyond his wildest dreams, that America was built by people who weren't afraid to ask hard questions and challenge powerful men. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let some frightened politician convince me to forget that. The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual polite television audience response. This was something deeper, more visceral, the sound of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Dean raised his hand to quiet the crowd, then looked back at the camera one final time. Senator McCormack, you tried to silence me because you thought I was just an entertainer without any real power. You were wrong. I don't have political power, but I have something better. I have a microphone, I have an audience, and I have the courage to use both. And as long as I draw breath, I'll use them to defend the freedom that makes this country worth fighting for. With that, Dean Martin walked off the stage, leaving behind a television audience of 20 million Americans who had just watched an entertainment legend transform into something else entirely, a defender of principles that transcended party politics or career concerns. The aftermath was immediate and devastating for Senator McCormack. Within hours, his office was flooded with angry phone calls from constituents who had watched Dean's speech. Newspapers across the country ran editorials questioning McCormack's attempts at censorship. Liberal and conservative commentators alike criticized the senator's threats against artistic expression. By Monday morning, McCormack found himself isolated in Washington, with even fellow Republicans distancing themselves from his campaign against Dean Martin. The attempted censorship had backfired spectacularly, making McCormack appear petty and authoritarian while elevating Dean to the status of a free speech hero. McCormack tried to respond with a press conference, but his attempts at justification only made things worse. I was simply trying to encourage responsible entertainment, he claimed, but the explanation sounded hollow after Dean's passionate defense of artistic freedom. The senator's political career never recovered. In the 1970 midterm elections, McCormack lost his seat to a Democratic challenger who made the incumbent's attack on free speech a central issue in the campaign. McCormack faded into obscurity, remembered primarily as the politician who tried to silence Dean Martin and learned the hard way that some Americans refused to be intimidated. Dean's television show, meanwhile, reached new heights of popularity. The March 15th episode became one of the most watched variety shows in television history, and Dean found himself receiving support from unexpected quarters. Young viewers who had never paid attention to his music suddenly saw him as a champion of their generation's right to question authority. More importantly, Dean's stand had sent a message through the entertainment industry that political intimidation could be successfully resisted. Other performers, emboldened by Dean's example, began speaking out more freely about social and political issues. Years later, when asked about his confrontation with Senator McCormack, Dean would say simply, "Nobody tells me what to sing. Not politicians, not sponsors, not anybody. That's what freedom means, the right to make your own choices and accept the consequences." The lesson of March 15, 1969, wasn't about Vietnam or anti-war protests or even television censorship. It was about the moment when an individual must choose between personal safety and fundamental principles. It was about the recognition that freedom requires constant defense, especially against those who would restrict it in the name of patriotism. Senator McCormack had made the classic mistake of confusing compliance with loyalty, assuming that questioning government policy was equivalent to opposing the country itself. He discovered to his political cost that many Americans understood the difference between loving your country and obeying its politicians. Dean Martin proved that night that courage doesn't always come wrapped in military uniforms or political manifestos. Sometimes it comes in a tuxedo, holding a cigarette, speaking calmly but firmly into a television camera. Sometimes the most powerful defense of freedom comes from an entertainer who simply refuses to be told what he can and cannot say. In the end, McCormack learned what tyrants throughout history have eventually discovered, that the attempt to silence free expression often amplifies the very voices they're trying to suppress. And Dean Martin learned something too, that sometimes the greatest performances happen not when you're singing someone else's songs, but when you're speaking your own truth to power.